All right, good to go. So let's just talk briefly about just some business stuff. So I sent out that email last week about canceling the third paper. I'm guessing that's probably fine with everyone, since it just means you have to do less work. But if anyone has any concerns with that whatsoever, just get in touch with me, let me know. Got a pretty good job with the presentations going. We'll have the first actual presentation that's not just a paper on Thursday. Uh, Someone's made a video for us to watch, so I will send out links to that as we go. Um, we're going to finish up, I'm pretty sure, with Badal today. And then we'll turn to the entropic definition of life stuff once we get done with that. So we'll probably have at least another week and a half or so doing this life stuff, which is why I pushed the paper back, just because I didn't want you to have two papers due super close to one another. So yeah, that's the rough plan. We might even just do a little bit more of this life stuff too, just because why not, right? There's not really going to be a paper on the third unit, so the third unit's already be truncated anyway. Maybe we do in fact talk about some sludge monsters in class. Maybe we talk about some panpsychism. Maybe we throw a little bit of both in, because we're already gonna be delayed. Why not just go all out with it, right? Go full bore delayed. So yeah, that's the plan for the next little bit. The papers now have a definitive due date. They're due basically the last week of class. So you don't have to actually have anything to do for this class during finals period, right? Unless you're doing a presentation during that time. Otherwise, the last sort of official assignment will be during the final period. So final week of class, not during the finals period. Yeah. All right. Any last business issues or questions before we get started for the day? All right. Yeah, it's motivation is I'm sure fluctuating for all of you as it is varying for me. This is weird times, weird situations. Yeah, thanks everyone for all your good work. And if anyone's having any issues with things, please don't hesitate. Let me know about them. And with that in mind, let's start defining some life forms. So let's just begin by doing some review from last class. So the first, 3 pages or so of the Badal that we actually got through. All right, so according to Badal's hypothesis, what's really distinctive about life is, one, these sort of teleonomic properties that we've been just talking about, or these teleonomic behaviors. But not just that, it's how enormously diverse the variety of these teleonomic behaviors are. Different living things function in such radically different ways, and they're capable of engaging in so many different kinds of behaviors that this to him actually is what strikes him sort of almost most essential about life. How many different kinds of life we actually encounter. We don't just encounter one kind of tree, we encounter millions of kinds of trees, each doing different things, engaging in really different behaviors. Similarly with animals, with fungi, with bacteria, with anything you want to look at, you're going to find an enormous variety of these teleonomic or purposeful behaviors. And that's why it's difficult to define what life is, right? Or to give any sort of one overarching account of life, because you just have so many different kinds of behaviors. Any property you pick out, you probably will find some life forms that don't behave that way. Just because life behaves in so many different ways, you'll seemingly be able to find exceptions to almost any rule that you sort of attempt to posit. Okay. But with that said, why should we bother even trying to give an account of life? Right? What's the point? Well, we need to really be able to give this sort of account, Badal thinks, in order to make progress in asking certain real meaningful questions that we should be concerned with as scientists, we should be concerned with as philosophers, and we should just be concerned with as thinkers, as people sort of thinking about the world. Right? Suppose we find something weird on Mars. Is it a life form? Have we found life on Mars? We actually need some sort of account of what we mean by life in order to answer that question, and that question seems to be meaningful, important, one people would care about. Another question that we might care about, is life a binary? Is everything either sort of alive or not alive, right? If you sort of meet the baseline threshold, you're in the life club. Otherwise, you're not in the life club, and there's nothing else to say. Or should we be able to talk about sort of a continuum or gradations of life? That things can be more or less alive. Maybe there is a hard and fast cutoff between life form, not life form. But within the class of life forms, do some display this property of life to a greater extent or a lesser extent, or is it just an all or nothing? Right? And so this question might seem a little bit odd to some of you, but again, you just do a historical analog. Aristotle, at least, and the ancients thought there were, in fact, gradations of life forms. That the more sophisticated you became, the more quote-unquote alive you were. To the extent that actually they thought, Aristotle at least, thinks human beings aren't the most alive thing. Aristotle actually thinks the universe as a whole is the most alive thing, because it displays a level of complexity and, in his mind, intelligence that individual humans don't, and so it has the properties of life forms to a greater extent. Right? We don't necessarily know what the answer to this question is, right? Either answer perhaps could be okay, but we should at least be able to ask this question in a meaningful way, and our account of life should help us in answering it. Right? We should make progress in answering the question based on the account we give of what a life form actually is. Here's another question. What is the proper referent for the term life? Right? Should we be talking about single cells as alive? Well, okay. It seems like we should be talking about single cellular organisms as alive. That's pretty clear. But what about the cells in my body? Should those count as alive? What about my organs? Should those count as alive? Organisms as a whole, everyone sort of agrees that those are alive in some sense. What about species, though? Or whole ecosystems, or planets, or like we were talking about with Aristotle, the universe as a whole? I mean, at least in principle anyway, we should be able to ask meaningfully, what is the proper level of description at which we're talking about life? Or if there's more than one, what are the proper levels of description? And how can we sort of understand their relationship to one another? Again, our account might not answer this question in its entirety, but it should help us make progress in answering this question and gaining some sense of what precisely should be the sort of the paradigm case of a life form. Next question Badal thinks we need to answer. Is life primarily a question of form, or does form and matter necessarily work together? Everyone agrees that form is involved. The question is really more the status of the material constituents, right? So all life as we know it is carbon-based and involves very specific carbon-based chemical processes. Do those carbon-based chemical processes themselves, do they matter for something to be a life form? Or are they kind of incidental? What matters is the formal result of those processes, the teleonomic behaviors, the sort of what Mayer was calling these sort of emergent properties. Are those what matter? And if it really is just the formal properties that matter, can we abstract life entirely from its material constituents? We'll talk about this one today a little bit in depth, actually, near the end of class. Our account of life should help us answer this question. And then lastly, our account of life should in some sense help us make progress, Badal thinks, toward understanding the relationship between life form on one hand and a mind, a consciousness, or a moral person. These are not necessarily synonyms, but they're at least related concepts. How are these things related? Are all moral persons life forms? Are there some moral persons that aren't life forms? We could perhaps conclude the Data really shouldn't have been characterized as alive in Star Trek, but he should have been characterized as having a mind or as being a moral person, as mattering ethically. Conversely, we could well determine that the opposite is true, and that if you are not alive, you could not possibly have characteristics of consciousness or moral personhood. Again, our account of life should help with that. Just pause for a second. A lot of stuff. That's actually quite a lot for the first 3 pages of the text, actually. So it was probably okay that we spent an unduly long time going through it. So before we get to start moving in the direction of the new stuff for today, any questions, thoughts about any of this review that we've done so far? All right, doing okay so far? Good. Then let's finish up with the review and then start a little bit with the new. All right. So this is what we should look for. The account that he's going to offer, it's not going to help us answer all these questions. I don't really see him offering much in terms of this moral personhood question. But it is going to actually help at least with the other 4 questions. His account, whether it's right or wrong, at least he's going to give an account, and on the basis of that account, it's going to suggest certain answers to the other 4 questions. So we'll be able to sort of put his account to the test and see how well it's really working, I guess, as we sort of unfold what it is he's actually proposing. All right. So he suggests that there are 4 commonly given sort of accounts of what life is. We've also just got a chat question. How does the definition of life and consciousness apply to single-celled organisms or things like simults? That would be the question, almost, I suppose, right? Like, we don't have know the clear answer to that question. So a theory like panpsychism is going to say that we should indeed say that single-cellular organisms should be described in some minimal sense. That indeed even non-living things, actually, according to panpsychism, should be described as conscious to some minimal extent. But there are other theories that are going to say that only life forms can show the property of consciousness, but that doesn't mean that all ones do. Maybe consciousness requires really advanced or sophisticated life forms in terms of development of things like neural structures. And both of those possibilities are left open, right? I mean, again, Vidal's not suggesting any particular answer to this question. He's just saying this is a meaningful question, and it's a way to sort of test if we've given an account of life, and does this account of life help us answer the question? I don't think his account of life actually particularly does help us answer this question, interestingly. But at least some of the people in the metabolic tradition are going to give us accounts that actually very strongly do suggest certain outcomes with regard to this. So I hope that helps with the chat question. All right. So we saw with Perry, as an example, he's not actually Vidal's primary target. Vidal's primary thinking of something like Wittgensteinian family resemblance theory that we're just not going to get into. But something like what Perry was saying, you could say that life is just a loose cluster of properties, right? That there's no sort of necessary or sufficient conditions for life, but there's just a series of properties, and, you know, what groups the properties together, and not really much. They sort of maybe vaguely resemble, or maybe match up with certain conventional notions humans have, but life's not really a natural kind. It's not really incredibly useful concept. Right. This is indeed a possible answer that we could give, but Vidal thinks this should be the last resort. Right. This is sort of basically to shrug your shoulders and say that there is no real account of life. Maybe we'll need to come to that, but we should try to come up with a lot first before sort of throwing up our hands and shrugging. All right, so a similar but different approach. Maybe we say life is a specific list of properties, and that these properties are sort of necessary and sufficient for life. All life forms will have the properties, and ideally only life forms will have these properties. We can think of the Koshland piece that we read as an example of this. And Perry thinks this, or not Perry, sorry, Vidal thinks this approach is perhaps useful, but it doesn't really answer the question. And he gives a really helpful example that I don't think we actually talked about last class, so I'll go into it now because I think it is actually a little bit helpful. He suggests that just defining this list of properties, so metabolism, growth, reproduction, yada yada, whatever list you want to give, like we could look at Koshland 7. Right? The problem with this is it's sort of like defining a disease just in terms of its symptoms. And you say like, okay, well, what is the flu? And you say, well, the flu is when you sneeze and you have a fever and you get chills and you have a back pain. Could you give that as a definition of the flu? Sort of, yeah. I mean, that you could maybe get a precise enough symptom list that it's only picking out the symptoms of the flu, and it's picking out all of the symptoms of the flu. But we would normally say that that's not enough to really understand what the flu is, right? What is the flu actually? The flu isn't its list of properties or symptoms. That list of symptoms is caused by a viral agent, and that's the actual essence of the flu. Defining life, and Koshland, but I don't think the same thing is happening in someone like Koshland's list of these properties, right? If you define a life form just by a long list of properties, all you're doing is describing sort of the symptoms of life. But you're not defining what's the sort of the agent or what's the causal thing that makes that the right list to have, right? So Vidal 7, why does life have to have those 7 properties? Why is it those exact 7? Why are those the necessary and sufficient properties? He doesn't think on an account like Koshland's, you can actually answer that question. You've got to go to something deeper, find some actual sort of underlying cause. Otherwise, if there really isn't some underlying cause, I think he just thinks this second one's just going to turn into the first one. It's just going to be some sort of arbitrary list of properties, and there's not really going to be anything sort of helpful about the list of properties you define. If we find something on Mars that's silicon-based, well, we've never seen a life form like that, so it's just not going to be on Koshland's list. Last possibility, Badal thinks, this is the one we're going to start working on next class period, that life could be defined in terms of a particular kind of metabolic process and a particular kind of entropic process. This is going to be the view of Schrodinger and a few other people that we read next week. Badal thinks this is indeed picking out something important and interesting. He's sympathetic to this because, one, it's doing what he actually suggests. It's actually identifying the underlying cause. The underlying cause would be metabolism. Right? And he thinks there is something really important about metabolic processes. They're not just some sort of accidental feature of life forms. He really does think there's something key that's being picked out in this sort of Schrodinger account. We'll talk a little bit about what he does with metabolism near the end of class today. But he thinks the problem with it is, unless you have some really clear definition of metabolism, you have to include, obviously, non-living things. His examples would be candles and vortexes, whirlpools, in other words, water swirling, in your list. And it doesn't seem like we want to call a vortex a living thing. Now, we might question if that's even true, but Al's going to include all kinds of stuff that we might be questionable if we want to call them living things too. But he thinks at least it's pretty obvious we don't want to let candles and vortexes into the club. Now, it's not clear to me he's working from a particularly rigorous understanding of metabolism. We might be, and indeed what we're going to get from Schrodinger and then some other authors is perhaps a more rigorous definition that doesn't include what a candle does or what's going on with a whirlpool. But for now, at least, we'll just have this sort of worry cause us to reject this metabolism stuff. Metabolism might be super important, but it's not going to be, at least according to Badal anyway, the actual cause of living things. All right. So again, now we're finally done with the review. Is getting through anything. Any sort of questions, any comments, any thoughts people have just about any of this stuff that we covered last period? All right, good. Then let us start with actually Badal's answer. So he doesn't think any of these work. What does he think actually works? What's his proposal? He's going to say that life consists in or is defined by supple adaptation or evolution. So let's just give the definition first, and we'll sort of define all of its parts, right? So basically he's saying a system is alive if and only if it can only be explained through a process of supple adaptation. Conversely, any system that can't be defined through a process of supple adaptation is not a living one. Lots to clarify with this definition. Let's just talk about how it would work with really obvious cases. So how does it apply to, say, my cat? My cat is obviously a life form because you can only describe the teleonomic behaviors of my cat as a result of a process of supple adaptation. That is how such an account would, in fact, be justified or understood. All right. So let's start defining some of the terms. And the one we're going to focus on first, let's actually, again, probably fairly obviously the most important of these. What do we mean by supple adaptation? So let's do some examples. So let's do a bunch of examples of things that aren't subtly adapted. All right. So here is a thermometer. You can see the thermometer. Right. Now, have there been many thermometers throughout the course of human history? Sure. Do we want to say that this thermometer is new enough? It's relatively new. Do we want to say it's better than the thermometers that existed in the 1800s? Sure, we should. This one's probably more accurate. Okay. So if that's right, could we call this a adapted system? Are thermometers adapted in some sense? Right? Are they undergone a kind of adaptation to better do a task? And indeed, Badal thinks they could. We couldn't decharacterize them correctly that way. And what do we mean by this? All we just mean is there's been a series of iterations in the thermometers. And as a result of these iterations, thermometers have adapted to become better at doing their job. And again, remember, what is the job of this thermometer? We can, using that Mayer account, right, we can say really directly, the job of this thing, we can describe it as having the teleonomic behavior of measuring the temperature. Why does it have the mercury in the particular place that it is with the little numbers drawn on the side? Of course, like, why is all that stuff there? It's there in order to help humans measure the temperature. So someone's asking in the chat, what's the difference between something adapting due to human intervention versus something that adapts on its own through genetics? Indeed, this is exactly the question that we're going to explore in a second. Because while this might be an adapting system, it is not a subtly adapting system. It's not undergoing supple adaptation. And so that is what we will need to clarify. So in a second, so I'll almost just say, great question, hold the thought for another 5 minutes and see if I answer it. All right. Why do we want to say this thing is not supply adapting? Why do we just want to call it an adaptive system? This is what he's going to call a rigidly adapting system. And he thinks that almost all human artifacts are going to have this property. Right? This property of rigid adaptation. And other examples he gives, he talks about street lights as an example. Right? Street lights have gotten better and better at the teleonomic behavior of lighting up the street. But it does so rigidly. And this is going to be the sort of like this sort of key idea here of what we mean by rigid. It's an optimizable process. It's only trying to make one particular behavior and optimize that one particular behavior. And in the case of the thermometer, telling the temperature. It is indeed the case that the thermometer is getting better and better at telling the temperature, but that's its only behavior, and that's all it's sort of been adapting on the basis of. It's only been adapting on the basis of that one specific behavior. We can even define certain kinds of natural selection in this way. His example of this is let us say that cats. And this isn't his example, but this is an example of his own spirit at least. So let us say, what is the dominant natural selection pressure taking place in cats right now? Cat species? It's us, right? What cats tend to survive? Cute ones. Why? Because we adopt the cute ones. What happens to the uncute ones? They don't get adopted. They have to be euthanized, right? So there's a natural selection pressure in cats right now toward them becoming cuter. It is not a normal evolutionary pressure, though, right? Like the trait that they're surviving on the basis of is a single trait, the trait of cuteness. And so what should we expect to happen over time? We should expect cats to become cuter and cuter and cuter over time, until eventually almost some sort of like cuteness singularity is reached in cats. where that's all that the cat is doing. The cat is just really, really super good at cuteness. If any of you ever watched the Tribbles in Star Trek, if any of you watched the original episode, they're basically just these like little balls of fluff that purr really cutely. That's almost like how I would imagine what the end point of this would be, weaponized cuteness or something. There, we even have a natural selection pressure, right? It's not that humans are engineering cats to be cuter. That was what was going on with the thermometer. We've engineered the thermometer to get more precise. It's not even so much that we're exactly genetically engineering the cat to become cuter, but the kind of natural selection pressure that's been exerted upon the cat is one that sort of has an optimization condition. It's only being selected for one specific behavior. That doesn't apply to evolution as we normally think about it. So one of the things Vidal wants to do is just almost define really rigorously what he actually means by natural selection and evolution. They are supple. This is what he means by supple adaptation. There is no one trait that evolution is selecting on the basis of. Indeed, the pressures that an organism faces are constantly changing. So let's talk of dinosaurs for a second. What were dinosaurs really, really good at? Killing things and eating them. That is what dinosaurs were exceptional at. That was, and indeed that makes them, that's a perfectly intelligent behavior, it seems like, for a life form to develop. Okay, why did dinosaurs die out? They didn't stop being really, really good at killing things. Indeed, you could make a strong argument that dinosaurs are far better at killing things than any of the predators that currently exist in life right now. If we were just selecting on the basis of that one behavior, maximally efficient killing, dinosaurs seem like they actually fit the bill better than like a lion. They're way bigger, they're way stronger, they have way bigger teeth. But why did the dinosaurs die out? Well, they died out because being maximally efficient at killing other things stopped being useful in the environment in which they had lived. Their ecosystem changed, their ecosystem altered such that life became really scarce. So actually the ability to conserve energy became way more important than killing things. Because killing things takes a lot of energy, right? Dinosaurs were great at killing things, but they had to burn through an enormous amount of energy to do so. They're similar to sharks in that way, right? Like sharks are always eating, because if sharks sort of like ever stopped eating, they would die because of how much energy it takes to actually be as good of a killer as a shark is. That was no longer a useful behavioral trait for dinosaurs. And so what happened? Dinosaurs went extinct, right? They were so good at killing things, but it didn't matter because that was no longer the trait that was being selected for as a result of changes in the dinosaur's environment. What became selected for changed to being things that had the ability to really do a good job of conserving their energy resources. So not even being more efficient, it was actually predominantly scrounging mammals that were the main things that survived. So things that weren't particularly good at killing things at all, actually. But what they were really good at was preserving their energy resources in a very tight sort of energy ecosystem. So they were really good, not so much at killing things, but they were really good at storing food, hibernating when they needed to, that kind of deal. And then that became the behavior that things were selected on the basis of. What did that lead to dinosaurs to do? It led dinosaurs to become the birds that we see today. Right? Birds are indeed the evolutionary byproduct of millions of years from dinosaurs, but they're where the selection pressures changed, that they were no longer being selected on the basis of their ability to kill things really, really efficiently, but on the ability to efficiently conserve energy resources, efficiently conserve food resources. That's what we mean by supple. There's no one trait that evolution selects on the basis of. And this is why life is as diverse as it actually is. All kinds of behaviors could and are be suitable for survival. And so you see life forms evolve that demonstrate an enormous variety of behavioral variation. You've got things as great at killing as sharks, the things as great as cleaning the teeth of sharks. And both of those are behaviors produced by natural selection pressures in an actual evolutionary system. It's not optimized. Because indeed, both are equally good. If you are really good at killing things and you're a shark, great. We can select for that. You'll live really well. Conversely, if you're really great at living inside the mouth of sharks and cleaning their teeth, great. That shark will do better and you'll be able to eat the shark refuse. Both behaviors get selected for. There's not some one thing that evolution is optimized toward. That's why we have as diverse of things that we do. And it's why things like, even like machine learning, for all that it sort of imitates life forms, it's still optimized. And it still fundamentally only selects on the basis of a single behavioral characteristic. Imagine I'll do this one because it's so obvious that you should be able to see the problem even on your own. Imagine you were going to play tic-tac-toe as efficiently as possible. How many strategies would you end up with? You all tell me. Do people still play tic-tac-toe? Do you all know what that game is? I should make sure that first. How many strategies are there for winning a tic-tac-toe? Yeah, 2. And really, they're just variations of the same strategy, so it's really just 1. There's basically a perfectly optimized way of playing tic-tac-toe. But when you were kids, right? So assuming kids still actually do in fact play tic-tac-toe. When you were a kid and playing tic-tac-toe, at first, you probably like put the X in all kinds of stupid places, right? That's why kids can still play a tic-tac-toe. They didn't figure it out. But once you figure out how to play tic-tac-toe, it's incredibly boring. It's an incredibly dull game because there's only basically one way to play. We believe the same thing is true about chess. We haven't proven this yet. It's obviously an infinitely more complex game, but we suspect that chess is actually has basically an optimization or a win state, and that there's really only one smart way to play chess. This is the guess. Go is even orders more complex, so they don't know if it's true or Go. But what we're noting with a lot of the machine learning stuff that we're doing is that at first, when you have these machines learning how to play chess, they're doing all kinds of stuff. They're engaging in all kinds of different strategies, but eventually they become optimized. They start doing not a lot of different things. They start doing one thing hyper precisely, hyper well. Right? And someone's saying like, yeah, they play chess with someone who has these sort of set moves that really do well, that sort of win. And that's right, because it seems like it's optimizable. You're not going to get the diversity of life if life was an optimizable system. Life is as diverse as it is that because there's no one behavior that helps you live above all others. And so as a result, all kinds of different behaviors emerge. Whereas the computer that's really good at playing chess, or the computer that's really good at the sort of nightmare scenario of a computer destroying the world just by like optimizing the world to produce cans of soup really well. Have you heard of this thought experiment? It's basically like, imagine telling an AI, make soup as well as possible. And that's your only instruction. And so eventually the computer decides that the most efficient way of making soup will be to kill all the humans that get in the way of soup manufacturing and start like mass producing the earth into a soup manufacturing plant. This works. It's doing its job. It's doing the one optimized task it was programmed to do as well as possible. Life's just not like that. There is no one task life is trying to accomplish. All life forms need to survive, but that's not a behavior. Surviving isn't actually a behavior, right? The teleonomic behaviors are ways that life forms go about surviving. That's what there doesn't seem to be any sort of optimization condition. That's what we mean by supple adaptation. Adaptation that can go and move into any possible configuration that will befit life. And this is sort of called for by changes in the environment. And in a constantly changing environment, what behaviors are selected for will constantly be changing. And also because life forms have to compete with one another. And if I have to constantly be competing with other things to survive, again, what behavior will help me find a niche? Well, that will constantly be changing too as the organisms around me change, as the organisms evolve, me adapt. Right? I guess you could say the optimistic thing during times of pandemic that we could think, viruses and bacteria tend to get less damaging and destructive to their hosts as time goes along. Why? Because a bacteria that kills its host really, really quickly, guess what? That host is not going to be able to cough on people. Right? The ideal case for a bacteria is to keep you alive as long as possible, coughing as live as possible. So that way you cough on as many people as you can. The hope is that therefore the coronavirus will, as it continues to adapt, that it will actually not become more virulent, it'll become less virulent. And there's some evidence that actually the flu used to be as virulent as the coronavirus did too, in the distant past, but its selection pressures, it didn't get better at killing people. That wasn't the behavior. The behavior actually was keeping your host alive as long as possible so you could keep leeching off of it as long as possible. That would be an example of this sort of subtly adapting process. It's not trying to get really good at any one thing. It's just doing whatever it takes, manifesting whatever behaviors it needs to survive in a constantly changing environment that's sort of constantly prompting life forms to develop new behaviors. All right, that was a lot, I know. So let's just stop for a second. Questions, thoughts? I'm sure people have things to ask about this idea of supple adaptation. And this has come up earlier in the semester a little bit. Many of you were sort of suggesting that evolution should be thought of as an optimizable system. Beddow is going to be our clearest author arguing that that's not correct, that there is no optimization here in the context of evolution. There's just different behaviors becoming differently useful at different times. And so everything humans have made up to this point, so go back to that question I got in the chat, and hopefully I've done at least a decent job of answering it. But everything humans have made up to this point, we've made rigidly adapting systems. We haven't yet, possibly with one little exception that we'll talk about a little bit later, made any actual subtly adapting systems. So my thermometer doesn't count as a life form. Street lamps don't count as life forms. My computer doesn't count as a life form. It's the selection pressures on all of those things aren't supple, they're rigid. And so they therefore don't count as life forms, at least not yet, and they aren't going to be complex enough. All right. So here is the beginning of Beddows' account. Life is this supple adaptation. Let's now take a moment to consider some of the implications of this view, right? Because it has some kind of weird implications, but also some kind of interesting ones. And again, before we do that, just do one last check. Any other questions, thoughts, comments before we keep going forward? All right, then let us keep pushing on. So what? What is the implication of this view? All right, well, here's one implication, and this is the big one. We'll get the big one out of the way first. Individual organisms are not undergoing a process of supple adaptation. Individual organisms don't evolve at all, or at least not in any sort of primary sense. What does evolve? Well, what evolves are species, right? When Darwin wrote his book on evolution, he didn't call it the evolution of that cat. He called it the evolution of species. So species are what are alive in the primary sense of the term. The species is the thing that's undergoing evolutionary change. It's not the individual members of its species that is undergoing any change. If we actually had to define what a species is, but now actually doesn't even ever use the word species because there's some philosophical complexity about precisely how you define what even a species is. What he describes it as the adapting system itself is the life form. What he means by the adapting system, though, is the species. The species is the adapting system, right? The system that is adapting is the overarching genetic drift within a particular cluster of organisms. That's what's actually being selected for, right? Like, if I have some really good evolutionary behavior that I'm doing that will help me survive, I don't get anything out of that. Who gets something out of it? My children. They get something out of it. They inherit the trait. And conversely, all my neighbors who don't have my great behavior, they die off. So the system is what's evolving. The species is the thing that's evolving. The species is what's alive in the primary sense of the term. Other things, like individual organisms, are only alive in a secondary sense insofar as their specific behaviors, I can spell, are explained by the supple adaptation of the species that's taking place on the species level. So why is my cat alive? She's alive and she counts as a life form, not because she's a supply adapting system, because she's not, but because she's, so to speak, part of a supply adapting system. Right? She's part of a evolutionary process of the cat species, right? And so why does, for example, she sharpen her claws? Because cats evolved that behavior because it was sort of telenomically useful in a particular environment. And so we can explain my cat's specific behaviors in reference to the evolutionary history of her entire species. That's the sort of secondary sense in which she can be said to be alive. She's not alive in the primary sense. Primary sense is it's her species that's alive. But because she can only be explained in terms of her species, she is sort of alive in a secondary sense. We could possibly say the same thing about her organs and her cells. Those two are explicable in terms of that evolution of the species as well. So all of those sort of lower level processes taking place within her, we can perhaps describe those as being alive in more distant tertiary senses, right? Or more distant senses. But the primary sense, that's the organism. And this is the big one. This is probably the really big one, the really counterintuitive one within the Tao in terms of the implications of this view. It's the one that certainly a lot of the entropic people are going to like. And someone's suggesting it seems like this definition would exclude data and the holographic doctor because they don't have a species that's evolving. Well, that entirely depends. If they become a species that is indeed evolving, then yes, they would count as life forms, but if they're just singular one-off things that are never going to become part of species, you are indeed correct. They would not count as life forms on this view. Right? But one other thing that's weird about this view, so maybe use this as an opportunity to jump into a second point. We're talking on a really long scale of time that we're talking here. because this evolutionary change that we're talking about, it's a really slow process. I am explained by things that happen just on a biological level, like parts of my body are explained by what happened hundreds of thousands probably of years ago, if not millions of years ago, in my sort of ancestral family tree. And so we're looking at a really long time frame that we're talking. And so maybe, you know, we can't yet say, it's going to sound super weird, we can't yet say that Data is alive, but if there's becomes a whole species of Datas, and those species of Datas do indeed undergo the right kind of supple adaptation pressures, then all of a sudden Data was alive, it turned out, by his reference to that other species. Right, that sort of species that he was a part of. But I actually think this is super weird that whether or not Data is a life form is going to depend on what happens perhaps thousands of years in the future. But I think that is sort of an implication of Badau's view. He actually isn't bothered by it though. He actually thinks one plus of being able to say that, we can explain why mules are alive. Because mules themselves can't reproduce, and there's lots of these. They tend to be sort of hybrid creatures, so a mule is a horse and a donkey bred together. A horse and a donkey will indeed produce viable offspring of the mule, but the mule itself won't produce viable offspring. And there's other things too. This is one way that species tend to get differentiated, is on the basis of their ability to produce viable offspring. We can actually explain on Badau's model, he thinks, why, even though mules can't reproduce, so they seem to violate that condition of all the lists people give for life forms, why are they still alive? Well, because we can explain why is the mule what it is on the basis of its sort of evolutionary background with horses and donkeys. So it's sort of, again, alive in only kind of a secondary sense or a tertiary sense. The mule doesn't really have a species, maybe in the proper sense of the term, but each individual mule refers back to some species that was the result of supple adaptation. So the mule might be an evolutionary dead end, but it's still part of an evolutionary system that sometimes produces dead ends. And so it can count as a life form because it's sort of the dead end produced by that evolutionary system. How are we doing? Is this making sense at this point, this idea that the species is the primary thing that's alive? It's really weird. This really violates a lot of our assumptions about the world. And the metabolic people are really going to hate it. The metabolic people are really going to hate this way of talking. But it has a lot of explanatory power. He's going to be able to explain a lot of stuff if you're willing to almost bite the bullet and go along with him on this, that is otherwise challenging to explain, that the metabolic people, for example, find challenging to explain. So we have a question: how does this work with species that are going extinct and that are sort of I think it works basically the same way. Extinction is sort of just another variant of sort of the mule case. So you can sort of run into with an extinct species as well. An extinct species might be an evolutionary dead end, at least at a given moment of time. But it still is the result of an evolutionary system, and a supply adapting system. The word supple is giving me trouble all day. Both the word supple and the word adaptation, I keep thinking I'm spelling them wrong all day, so I apologize if I have been spelling them wrong. And so since they are they have this evolutionary history, they still do count as life forms, right? Again, in that secondary sense, but because we're looking at a really long time frame, we can sort of see them as the end. So maybe if, if white elephants are going to go extinct, we can say the last few white elephants are the evolutionary dead end. They're not going to, the system's going to end with them, but at least they still are part of that whole huge history. And the thing that's alive is that whole huge long history. So the individual members are alive, even the ones that are extinct or dead ends, they're alive by reference back to the system that they're a part of. And so someone's asking, what about Jurassic Park? Yeah, the Jurassic Park dinosaurs would be alive, right? I mean, they had this weird hiccup, I guess, right? But for whatever reason, once they get going, those dinosaurs are going to at least, they're going to start breeding, then they're going to have an evolutionary future going ahead, right? And so it's that evolutionary future that they have that makes them alive. Weirdly, though, in the context of Jurassic Park, so just a reminder, the original plan of that movie is that they're going to make all these dinosaurs infertile, and that they're going to actually clone all of them. They don't want the dinosaurs actually reproducing because they thought it would be too unpredictable, and they might do things like, I don't know, subtly adapt all kinds of unexpected behaviors that the humans weren't ready to deal with at the time. If that original plan had gone through, and were just cloned, they would not count as life forms, actually, because they would no longer be part of an evolutionary system. They would be part of a rigid human system of change and cloning that was not actually supple adaptation. They wouldn't be subject to those selection pressures anymore. And again, that's the weird counterintuitive thing about this Badal view. Whether or not those Jurassic Park dinosaurs are going to count as alive doesn't just hinge on them, it hinges on their ancestors. It hinges on the way in which they're going to sort of grow and evolve and mutate and be selected going forward. And if that system is a supply adapting system, then indeed they will count as alive. I guess we can't know until we find out. That's, again, another weird feature of this, right? Same thing with the holographic doctor or Data. We can't know if they're alive until the future. We don't know that they're alive in the past at the very least. The past doesn't tell us that they're alive. And the present doesn't tell us that they're alive. It would be their future that would tell them they were alive. And in that case, it's because they're novel life forms, right? They're new life forms. They don't have any history. They don't have a past. And so then it would be, if in the future they are part of subtly adapting systems, they would then sort of retroactively be life because the system was alive. So how are you all feeling with this? I've gotten a few chat messages that were like, I think I get it, but I hate it, which is fine. that's certainly a valid stance. But the big thing, I want to make sure people are sort of getting it, I guess. So any further questions on that level? Have I answered all the chat questions? Anyone want to raise any other thoughts or issues at this point? Yes, and so yeah, someone's going back to that Jurassic Park case. That's right. Once those dinosaurs became part of an evolving system, they, in that secondary sense, can now be considered life forms. Note, though, that they're not what's important. They're not. What makes the system alive isn't the individual dinosaurs. What makes the system alive is it's a subtly adapting system. That's what made it alive. So that's why the dinosaurs in and of themselves, they don't count as life forms, or not just in and of themselves. They only count as alive insofar as they're part of a system. The system is the thing that's actually alive. It's a living system that then has certain individual members be related in certain ways that can be counted as life forms in a secondary sense. So I hope that answers that question, and if it doesn't, send me a follow-up. Let's talk about a few other implications of the view, just to continue helping to make it clear. Corpses are not alive. Right? So it's something we should want to be the case. Corpses are not alive. Corpses don't display teleonomic behaviors that are explained in evolutionary terms. So that's good. We should hope that. I think we shouldn't want to call corpses alive. And on his account, we don't need to. So that's a plus. Right? We don't actually need to. So we're good in that sense. We also don't. He thinks we don't need to. He doesn't really give much of an argument to justify why we don't need to be worried about individual organisms not being life in the primary sense. Just because he thinks we can still call them alive, so he still thinks that mostly we'll be able to call the same stuff we wanted to call alive before. We also don't need to worry about what he calls climax ecosystems. These are basically ecosystems that are sort of stable in a certain sense, and you see a lot less evolutionary change in these sort of stable climate ecosystems. Everything basically finds a niche for itself, and so you don't get the same selection pressures. But the reason he doesn't think we don't have to worry about these climate ecosystems is that because we're looking over a sufficiently long frame of time. No ecosystem actually stays in a climax position for very long. So yeah, maybe occasionally we'll run into certain ecosystems that we don't see evolution happening in maybe right now, but that's just a short-term thing. And again, we're looking over such a sufficiently long period of time that we don't really need to be worried about the sort of short-term glitches. What we care about is the long-term. Got a question here. Would New York City be a climax ecosystem, or would cities in general? Hold the thought. We're getting to we're a couple minutes away from another crazy implication that will directly hinge upon on how I answer that question. So I'll almost just say, hold on to that question about cities and life of cities. So before we get to that one, let's do one other implication. Creationism isn't just wrong. It's incoherent on this view. And along with a whole bunch of other things too. We'll talk about some of the other things that are wrong too. So what is creationism? Let's just pause for a second. Creationism is the view that humans are not the result of evolutionary forces, or that life in general is not the result of evolutionary forces, and that life was sort of created by a deity via, poof, let there be an organism, and the organism is poof there. Right. So Bedau thinks this is wrong. First of all, it's not true that that's how life forms emerged. But that's almost not the point. His claim isn't just that it's wrong. His claim is that it's incoherent. It makes no sense to imagine God creating life. Why? Well, because if God created life, life would not be the result of supple adaptation. Life is supple adaptation. Another thing, there's all kinds of other things that are impossible on this. Any account of life that doesn't involve supple adaptation isn't just wrong, it's incoherent. We could also say imagining an immortal species or an immortal organism. It's not just false that there are immortal organisms. It's incoherent to talk about an immortal organism, because an immortal organism could not be undergoing supple adaptation, nor is it part of a system that is undergoing supple adaptation. So again, it's not just that such organisms don't exist, they are incoherent conceptually. They make no conceptual sense whatsoever. All these cases are just fantasies. Only evolutionary explanations of life make sense. So other views to Darwinian evolution aren't just wrong, they're incoherent, they're nonsense. This is another, this claim to strike us as rather shocking, I think, right? Because people have only believed in Darwinian evolution for a relatively short period of time, right? What is it? Maybe like, we're getting close to probably 170, 180 years, something like that, right? That Darwin first articulates the theory. And there were some predecessors to it, so maybe let's say 200 years. Fine. We've been able to recognize life forms for way longer than 200 years. It turns out maybe we could have identified life forms, but we had no idea why they were life forms until Darwin came around. We had not the slightest hint until Darwin, right? We thought they were life forms because they were metabolizing, or we thought they were life forms because God made them to be life forms, or we thought they were life forms because they displayed teleonomic behaviors. And indeed, all of that was wrong. We were just completely incoherently, inconsistently confused when we thought any of that. The only thing that could ever explain a life form on this account that Bedau is giving is Darwinian natural selection. So by the way, if Darwinian natural selection turns out to be false, this whole theory would just, I guess that means that, I guess actually that wouldn't even invalidate his theory. If Darwinian evolution turned out to be false, I guess it would just mean that there were no life forms. Life just didn't exist. Because his theory actually doesn't even require Darwinian evolution to actually be occurring. I mean, it's sort of convenient, right? But he's just saying a living system is any system that undergoes Darwinian evolution. So if, in fact, things don't undergo Darwinian evolution, I guess they're not alive. I guess nothing's alive on this system. His account is deeply rooted in one particular scientific theory being correct. So someone's raised, I actually have a couple questions here in the chat, so let me try to go through them one at a time. Actually, they're pretty similar, actually. Both questions are sort of asking about certain maybe transhumanist kinds of cases where perhaps you've got, humans, quote unquote, evolving, but not really evolving, right? And downloading their consciousnesses into computers or making themselves immortal. And yeah, if that happened, we would no longer count as life forms on Badal's model, right? We would no longer be systems that it makes sense to describe on the basis of evolutionary pressures. We would, and indeed, the reason why, maybe we can even say, why do so many people get sort of, I guess, distressed by the idea of transhumanism? Not everyone, but some people do. I think it's because you could say, maybe from Badal's perspective, that transhumanism would be a rigidly adapting system. We could still talk about human beings as changing, but in a rigid optimization sense, not in the evolved sense. And if you think life is cool, and you think life is indeed supple adaptation, then yeah, all these sort of transhumanist scenarios, they're taking us outside of the scope of supply adapting systems, evolving systems in the strict sense of the term, and we would be weirdly killing ourselves. I mean, it's sort of weird, right? But like, I guess that would be the implication, right? We'd be making ourselves no longer a life form. We wouldn't even go away. We might still, that's why I don't think this account is helping us with consciousness at all. Maybe we'd be perfectly conscious computer programs, right? But we would no longer be life forms, and so we've died. In a very weird, strict sense of the term, we've actually died when we sort of undergo various kinds of sort of transhuman alterations to ourselves. And again, this would only be if these transhuman alterations made it so that it was no longer sensible to describe us as evolving via this process of supple adaptation. If we get robot bodies, but those robot bodies are still explicable using evolutionary principles, fine. Then those robot bodies are fine. But if it stopped being appropriate to describe human beings in terms of Darwinian evolution, if that was no longer a useful explanatory framework to explain the behaviors that we demonstrate, we would no longer be life forms. So I hope that helps with both of those questions. I hope that sort of addresses both of them. Again, send me a follow-up if it doesn't. Yeah, and so we can ask maybe about, like, so from the religious perspective, is there a place maybe for God in here? I mean, I think the reason why God saying poof, there's a life form wouldn't count on Badal's view is that it would just be a rigid creation. It'd be like the same thing we do when we create a thermometer, right? It would be the same kind of thing. It would not be a supply adapting system. God would presumably have designed each organism to do precisely what it does. And indeed, this is precisely what people thought. People thought each organism was created by God to do exactly what it was that it was doing, and that it does exactly what it was doing perfectly well. That's a rigid system, not a supple system, and so therefore it's just not subject to the right kind of evolutionary pressures, and so it doesn't count as a life form because it's not explicable in supply adapting cases. Okay. And yeah, I mean, this would apply just as readily, the follow-up, yeah, this would apply just as readily if God had made us, right? If God makes us to be something, yeah, then we are in fact optimizable in some sense. There's something we should be perfecting and doing, and therefore we're not a supply adapting system, we're an optimizable one. Now, if God just started natural selection processes in action and foreknew how those would turn out, that's fine. Then, right, because then again, the actual systems themselves, even if God was the initial cause or initiator of all the systems, fine, whatever. The system itself was still a supply adapting system, and we would need that. So this doesn't necessarily mean you can't believe that God exists or that God plays any role in the creation of life. God just can't go, poof, there's a life form. That's what's out. Right? If God said, let there be Darwinian evolution, then we're fine. Because then again, Darwinian evolution explains then everything that's supposed to be going on here. So you have a question here. Does this mean that the account of life is incompatible with the idea of telos, or the final cause in organisms? It would be a problem if the species itself was thought of as having a telos. It's not necessarily a problem if individual organisms have a telos, or at least if the telos was specific behaviors. So I want to make this subtle distinction. Let's just do this even in evolutionary terms. Is there a purpose of life in evolutionary terms? Sure, you can say that at least. Like, what is it? It's survival, right? What is every organism doing? It's surviving, and what is every organism being selected on the basis of surviving, right? So survival, in some sense, is kind of an overarching telos maybe of a certain sort, but that's not any particular behavior by which we survive, right? Surviving is really abstract. Surviving is not a concrete thing. Concretely, what does it mean for my cat to survive? Well, it means that she hunts prey using her claws and her teeth and her powers of motion and her senses. That's a very specific list of behaviors that other organisms that are similarly evolved organisms that are also just as much trying to survive, they're not going to show those same behaviors. So the thing that needs to be undergoing supple adaptation, the thing that has this sort of diversity to it, it's not surviving, it's the mechanisms of survival. It's the specific behavior that the organisms engage in to survive. That's the thing that requires these sort of evolutionary explanations. So the final cause of life being survival or whatever, that's all fine. I mean, that's not a biological question really anyway, really. The biological question is, by what behaviors do they realize their final causes? That is a biological question, and that could still be explained using supple adaptation on this account. So we could well still say, yes, all life is trying to survive in some sense. All the teleonomic behaviors are in some sense oriented towards survival, but they're all radically different teleonomic behaviors. That's the supple adaptation. The supple adaptation is variation of the behaviors by which survival is realized. I hope that helps. I hope that I hope that sort of clarifies how this is related to the idea of sort of the final cause. All right. Let's do one more implication. And this is, again, a big one. What are we letting into the Life Club in Badal's account? What do we let in? Okay, viruses. Those are fine. That's one borderline or boundary case, one case that we're really unsure of. Pierre, for example, had no idea whether or not to call these alive. Viruses, we can very clearly explain their behavior using evolutionary principles, so they're fine, but we can let them into the list. Here's a weird one, sludge monsters. By which, what do I mean by this? I mean this is the technical term, autocatalytic chemical systems. They could be let into the list. We'll talk a little bit more about precisely what I mean by sludge monsters later on. The idea here is a chemical process that autocatalyzes. This word literally means it catalyzes itself. So it basically maintains its own chemical reaction going by taking the chemicals it needs to catalyze out of its environment. This is a little bit about what's going on here is going to do with the Schrodinger stuff. So I'll save this a little bit. But these get involved. Again, that's not probably super controversial. Certain crystalline structures that actually do seem to undergo evolutionary pressures can be involved. They're involved. They can be part of the club. Again, that's probably not like super weird or super problematic. Let's get to some weird ones. Human economics might count. If, and it's just an if, but if evolutionary supply adapting systems, let me say it differently. if the system can be described, let me actually say this. I was going to put that super unclear. Let me put that more clearly. Human economics might count if economics is a supply adapting system. If it's the case that modern economics selects the best business plans, but what counts, but there's no one behavior that's getting picked out for the best business plan. The best business plan is whatever one's able to survive in the economic marketplace, then economics itself would be a life form. And again, note, the system was always the thing that was alive. It was never the individuals that are alive. The system, in the primary sense, if economic systems are supply adapting systems, they are life forms. So too is the marketplace of human ideas. If it is the case that human ideas similarly have to fight it out on the marketplace of survival, and the good ideas are the ones that survive, but good ideas take all of these different forms, and so they too undergo the kind of, it is another supply adapting system, then human intellectual communities are themselves life forms. The mind itself is alive, or the life of the mind at least is itself alive. And yeah, this doesn't even necessarily, someone asked in the chat, with this was this is specific to something like Marxist dialectical materialism. Not really, doesn't actually presuppose it. Certainly something like that would fit, but if it's the case that we just need to use this idea of supple adaptation to understand why some businesses go under and other businesses survive, the system of economics is alive, and those businesses are therefore alive in a tertiary sense. Right? Could the internet be considered alive? Sure. If the internet is describable as a supply adapting system, then yes, the internet is alive. Anything that you can describe as a supply adapting system is alive. Whether it coheres with or agrees with any of our normal intuitions or not. We actually are running low on time, and we have like maybe 15 more minutes to do. So, okay, let me rush to try to give the last one. I can do this one relatively quick. Let's talk briefly. Foremost amongst these things that he thinks counts, he thinks digital life counts. Any program, so we'll talk more about this in greater depth later. Digital life, if we have programs that are evolving via supple adaptation, they are alive. And in fact, he thinks there are indeed systems, computer programs that are doing this right now. He thinks AI researchers and artificial life scientists have created living systems of digital life, systems that the individual programs are engaged in an evolutionary struggle with each other for memory resources and are allowed to mutate their code when they reproduce, quote unquote reproduce, and that those mutations are then selected on the basis of natural selection pressures. It is a supply adapting system. They are alive. This isn't science fiction. This is science fact. We've got these digital life forms going right now because they are supply adapting systems. And indeed, he thinks we can get really precise with this, actually, right? I mean, he goes into great depth. I was hoping to talk a little bit more about this, but that's okay. We're low on time a little bit. He thinks you can actually measure precisely how much a system is supply adapting. He thinks this is actually measurable, which is great. That means we can actually really rigorously say. We can also talk about the extent to which a system is supply adapting. And so therefore, we could talk about degrees of life, he thinks. Just how alive is the system? Well, it's alive insofar as it's more and more supply adapting. So he thinks we indeed have digital life forms. We'll talk a little bit more about these digital life forms because there's going to be one article directly trying to refute him about digital life forms. So maybe we can return to that point a little bit later. Was a little bit rushed, but I hope it was clear enough at least, right? To just anything we can explain in this way is alive. So I have one last chat question, and we'll sort of end with this chat question. All right. So in this chat question, someone's suggesting that it seems like we can't find any definition that doesn't have unintuitive consequences. And Bedau perhaps agrees. He's like, yeah, he concedes that there's something sort of unintuitive about many of the moves that he's going to make. He just doesn't care. He just doesn't think that super matters. It's a really diverse phenomenon, and we're prejudiced toward life as we see it. Our intuitions are prejudiced towards life forms we're familiar with. And so something really new, like a digital life form or an economic system, right? It's going to violate our intuitions, but he's just going to say that's because our intuitions are just prejudices, right? Prejudices formed on the basis of too small of a sample size. He still thinks the essential sort of like insight of the intuition, the thing that we were interested in when we were looking at these things that we call alive, the teleonomic properties, we still preserve all of that. We still preserve why we were talking about life in the first place. We just realize that to be consistent, those teleonomic properties are found in far greater scopes in things than we maybe would have normally conceived of. Whether that's satisfying or not is a separate issue, right? And to the metabolic people, it's not going to be satisfying at all. They're going to really strenuously be opposed to all of this. All right, I've got to let you all go, unfortunately. There's more to say, but maybe we'll pick up a little bit here next class period. So for next period, I'm going to give you the Schrodinger. We'll see if we can get through it all in one day. Well, we'll see. Maybe it could happen. So I'll give you some. It won't be the whole essay by him. I'll also just give you some advanced warning. The first 5 to 6 pages is rough going unless you really know quantum mechanics. So go along with the first couple pages, just sort of let it be. Get to, right around when he starts talking about like living things directly, that's where it gets a little bit more readable. So try to struggle through the first couple pages, but focus more on the sort of latter half of it. And also, yes, good question. We probably won't talk about it, but do try to have the Philip K. Dick book, Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep, ready for Thursday. I might use a few examples from it on Thursday, but my guess is I'll more be talking about it next Tuesday. But yeah, this idea, it's gonna have some very interesting things to say about the relationship between life and entropy. All right, I'm sure there's also questions still left, so I'll let me end the recording. So class is dismissed.